Professor Finkelstein, the last thing I want to talk about before we get you out of here is the geopolitical ramifications in which this situation could spin out of control into, because I don't think a lot of people understand what this means. I presented this scenario where, Israel obviously is trying to, what I see, goad America into a war against Iran. And we heard what Lindsey Graham said. We understand there's a relationship between Iran and Russia and how badly that situation could just spin out of control, where you have two major powers attacking each other. This is the comment by the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova on the sharp escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Russia is gravely concerned over a sharp escalation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In this we would like to reaffirm our principled and consistent stance that this conflict, which has continued for 75 years, cannot be resolved by force and can be settled exclusively by political and diplomatic means, by engaging in a full-fledged negotiation process based on the well-known international legal framework stipulating the establishment of an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with a capital in East Jerusalem that coexists with Israel in peace and security. We regard that the current large-scale escalation as another extremely dangerous manifestation of a vicious circle of violence resulting from chronic failure to comply with the corresponding resolutions of the UN and its Security Council, and the blocking by the West of the work of the Middle East Quartet of international mediators made up of Russia, the United States, the EU, and the UN. We call on the Palestinian and Israeli sides to implement an immediate ceasefire, renounce violence, exercise restraint, and begin, with the assistance of the international community, a negotiation process aimed at establishing a comprehensive, lasting, and long-awaited peace in the Middle East. Now, one thing I really noticed from this whole situation is I think that they're kind of quoting international law when they talk about the 1967 borders, but they're also, in my mind, implicating the fact that this siege and this blockade of Gaza is illegal. And, it's obvious the position they have taken over here. What are your thoughts on Russia's statement when it comes to Palestine?
Be perfectly frank with you. That is an excellent statement. You know what? It's surprisingly excellent because it says everything that needs to be said.
Yeah.
Namely, number one, there has been for 50 years, I told you at the beginning, I can't go through the whole history. There has been for 50 years a framework for resolving the conflict. And all parties, except for the United States, now it's a little wavering, the European countries, and I will grant, because I am confident the truth is on the side of justice. So I'm not afraid of the truth. That Hamas, Hezbollah rejected that framework. Now, first let me state the framework, and then I'll tell you what Hamas and Hezbollah have had to say. The framework is very simple, exactly what she said. That was an elegant, precise, accurate statement. She said the framework is two states on the June 1967 border. She is accurate that the entire world community embraced that formula with the exception of the United States, and it's not a state. Hamas, up until 2006, when it got elected, yes, it opposed that framework. There seemed to be reasonable possibilities in 2006 that its position would evolve. When Hezbollah was asked about that framework, the leader of Hezbollah, Syed Nasrallah, he said, "We don't support it. However, if that's what the Palestinians want, we won't stand in the way." The state of Iran has repeatedly voted in the UN to resolve the conflict on those terms being, and you were very perceptive in your comment. I compliment you on your mental acuity. They framed their response in the terms of international law. That's what the law says. The chief lawbreakers, indeed, the only lawbreakers, are the United States and the state of Israel, who refuse the terms for now a half century to resolve the conflict diplomatically and allow all parties to live in peace. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
I have to say that was a remarkably succinct, lucid, and what's most important, accurate account of how we got here on this day.
Yeah.
The U.S. and Israel refuse or thumb their nose at international law because Israel will not accept that Palestinians have the same right to self-determination, the same right to breathe. Because to quote that Israeli official, they're all human animals.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
The Israeli Ubermenschen, the supermen who have such contempt for the Palestinians and for Arabs in general. And I would say, at the end, if you'll allow me a small digression, and then we'll end it. My mother and father were in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were there until the uprising. And periodically there was the 40th anniversary of the uprising, the 30th anniversary, and my mother would be interviewed because she was one of the survivors. And she tended to downplay the significance of the uprising. She said it's so exaggerated. We only had a few guns. We were up against the German army. If the Soviet Red Army couldn't defeat the Germans, do you think a few starving Jews in the ghetto could? So she said it's so exaggerated. And once a person interviewed her, a friend of mine at the time, and said, but is there anything redemptive from that event? And my mother thought hard, and she said, you know what? The human ingenuity that those fighters displayed, because remember, the ghetto was filled with catacombs, tunnels. They were called bunkers. And the bunkers were dug by hand. They had only the most primitive implements. And my mother said it was a real credit to human ingenuity what these young people did. And now I will say something else, which might get the wrath of God, speaking as an atheist, the wrath of God on me. You cannot help but admire and respect the ingenuity of the people of Gaza. Remember, Gaza is smaller than a postage stamp. You know? It is the most surveilled place on God's earth. All of the super technology that Israel brought to bear, or has brought to bear, to probe every nook and cranny in Gaza. And it's such a small space. And yet, they managed to plot a very complex operation under these very strange circumstances.
Like prisoners. That prisoners got nothing to do but make a plan all day.
I know, but there's one difference. It's prisoners who are being surveilled 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with the most sophisticated surveillance technology known to date to humankind. It's a credit, I believe. It's a credit to human integrity, and it's also a credit to the thirst, the unquenchable thirst for freedom. So, at this point, acknowledging all the horrors that occurred, I respect that achievement of the people of Gaza. Now, I know people are going to go berserk and bonkers over what I said, but I will remind them John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. We celebrate the man who, in his fanaticism, committed significant atrocities because he was so committed to the ending of slavery, which he considered an inextinguishable sin. And I think we should also honor, even though a lot of quote unquote, I will drop the quote unquote, a lot of innocent blood was spilled, we should honor the right of the people of Gaza, the slaves of Israel, who have risen in revolt and who realistically will quite likely perish. I, for one, honor that memory the same way as I sing John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave. The God above in heaven looks kindly down. And I believe, as a resolute atheist notwithstanding, the God above in heaven looks kindly down on the last desperate effort of the people of Gaza to free themselves from that concentration camp.
Professor Finkelstein, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I don't know if you know this, but I grew up in Boca Raton, South Florida. I moved to New York when I was a young kid. My graduating class was about 85% Jewish, and I had a lot of mentors that were pro-Zionist. And when it came to this subject, I hid for quite a while. I didn't want to talk about it. I thought it was too controversial. But after what happened on Saturday, I thought it would be a good point, a good time to stop hiding, because I think it's desperate times, and I don't want to see a genocide take place because a lot of us were silent. And I thank you for coming on and having this conversation with us here on the Jimmy Dore Show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
We'll see you soon. Professor Finkelstein, ladies and gentlemen.
Hey, come see us on tour. We're going to be in Dallas, Houston, San Diego, Bloomington, Illinois, Indianapolis, and Levittown, New York. Wow, that's a lot of dates. See you there.